Economic development and services for Indigenous children and families were among the topics discussed at today's meeting between the premiers and Indigenous leaders. But as we've seen in communities like Attawapiskat, progress can be painfully slow. Joining us from Winnipeg to talk more about this is Sheila North. She is a former Manitoba Grand Chief, and she's an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And from Toronto is Russell Diabo. He is an Indigenous policy analyst. Thank you both for joining us this evening. And I want to start with that water situation, the struggle for clean drinking water for First Nations people. How big of a problem is this, Russell, and what needs to be done to finally solve it?
Well, I think it's a huge problem. That was one of the first promises the Prime Minister made when he formed the government, was that he was going to get rid of the boil water advisories. And although they have reduced some, obviously, situations like Attawapiskat, which have been around for years, haven't been addressed. So the Prime Minister hasn't kept his promise in that regard. And, you know, he's identified $21 billion, I believe, for programs on reserve in the past 4 budgets. And you'd think that he would have been able to target some of that money for addressing this water situation at Attawapiskat, which they've known about, you know, for the past 4 years.
Sheila, why is the water issue so difficult to solve?
Well, it's difficult to solve because the political will isn't there to fix the problem. And water is a basic human right that we all have rights to have access to. And I think that this is indicative of what the government actually thinks about some of the issues about Indigenous people in this country. And that has to be addressed. When we see a government buying a pipeline for that much amount of money, they could have spent that much money fixing all the boil water advisories in one fell swoop. Maybe that's a little too simple to say. I know that there's technicalities and things that have to be improved technically, but I think the political will could have been stronger to address the boil water advisories across the country faster.
47% of First Nation children on and off reserve live in poverty. What do you make of that statistic, Russell? Does it seem low to you? What can be done to improve the lives of these kids?
Well, my friend, the late Arthur Manuel, said there's 3 phases to Canadian colonialism. There's dispossession, which leads to dependency, which leads to oppression. And the poverty that exists is a direct result of, you know, centuries and decades of Indian policy to put Indigenous peoples on reserves, which aren't big enough to be economically viable, and in locations far from non-native settlement. And that's one of the issues, is land and resources. You know, the National Chief talks about closing the gap and economic development, but that's not going to happen unless the provinces agree that they're going to restore some of the lands and resources that have been taken illegally from First Nations.
Was there anything surprising in those statistics for you, Sheila?
No, I think it's becoming redundant and old news. But that's very, very sad as well, because we're talking about real people here, real children, Canadian children who should have the best in life as their non-Indigenous counterparts in other communities. And I think it again shows that political will isn't there, and that we have to return to a place where we're running our own affairs. Restore the jurisdiction that Indigenous people have had, inherent jurisdiction and rights and titles to the land, to be able to, decide on the future that's best for their children and their families. Because, we're talking about real lives, as I say, and the impact is great. If we want generations of our Indigenous people, if we want to see our kids prosper and make a go of life and contribute well in society, we have to give them the resources to do that. And right now that's not the case, and poverty causes trauma. Dr. Martin Brokenleg talks about that all the time, and I think that's the reality check that we all have to talk about as Canadians, and how are each of us going to address that.
We heard AFN Chief Perry Bellegarde talk about the Bill C-92 recently passed. It's a new law allowing Indigenous groups to secure control of child and family services in their communities. That was one of the reasons why the AFN rejoined these meetings with the premiers. What are your hopes for the legislation, Russell?
Well, Cindy Blackstock said that, and she was the one who pushed the human rights complaints against the federal government. She said that Bill C-92 was fundamentally flawed because it didn't provide the funding necessary for First Nations jurisdiction to be realized. And that's going to be the problem, is implementing that legislation is basically still pretty much the status quo, with the provinces controlling a lot of the child and family services off reserve.
The Grand Chief spoke about that earlier today on Power and Politics. Here's what he had to say.
You got to make sure you have the proper fiscal resources in place to make sure that you have the proper human resources and all the programs and services that are needed to focus on keeping children healthy, making sure they have the services and programs at their fingertips. It's a human rights crisis, so we've got to work with the federal government, no question, looking at the implementation of the bill and what does that look like. Working with a specific First Nations process for us, because again, we have a lot of First Nations children in that system, and so we need a specific process for First Nations jurisdiction to be respected. And so that's the work going forward now. We've got to set up that process with the federal government, but we also make sure that the provinces and the territorial governments are involved.
Sheila, do you think that the money is going to be there? Are you confident that the First Nations will get those fiscal resources needed to help Indigenous children?
I guess time will tell, but as Russ says, it's a jurisdiction that has to be in place before we can see real differences. And I hear the National Chief talking about programs and services, but I'm hearing across the country from leaders and even business economists in our Indigenous community say we have to get away from relying on government programs and services and restore the jurisdiction that is rightfully ours so we can run our own affairs, take care of our own children, take care of our families. So I think there's some goodwill and good words there by the National Chief, but it doesn't go far enough.
Okay, let's talk about something that's a little bit more positive, and that is the fact that almost 3/4 of Indigenous youth who took part in a new survey said that they are optimistic that there will be meaningful reconciliation in their lifetime. Russell, what do you make of that optimism in light of the things that we've been talking about, in light of the challenges that still exist?
Well, I don't know which youth participated in the survey, but I do know there is an Indigenous youth resistance campaign where they've been holding demonstrations and protests across the country saying that reconciliation is not happening, certainly not fast enough and not in any fundamental way. So I'm wondering who participated in that survey.
Sheila, a final thought on the optimism there. Do you buy it?
I do, because I know that we as Indigenous people have been resilient through all the things that we've been through, the residential school, the 60s scoop, this whole missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls issue that's been going on. I think we find a way to find the positives, and I am an internal optimist, and I hope that our younger generations are feeling strength, and I hope that they're feeling that they are making a difference, and they will make a difference, because our forefathers and leaders before us have pushed us this far, and I hope that young people are inspired to keep pushing, to keep fighting for a better future for themselves, but also for the rest of Canada.
We got to leave it there. Sheila North and Russell Diabo, thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndsay.